The jungle was quiet that morning, too quiet. A stillness that didn't belong in a war zone. Then, from the distance, came the low, thumping sound of rotor blades cutting through the mist. A helicopter crested the ridge, dipping low over a barren hilltop surrounded by endless green. The name of that hill was Firebase Ripcord, and before the month was over, it would become one of the bloodiest and least known battles of the Vietnam War. In July of 1970, Ripcord was just another dot on a military map, a small outpost being rebuilt in the Shau Valley, a place American soldiers called Death Valley. Officially, it was a routine operation. In truth, it was a spark waiting for gasoline. A few hundred men from the 101st Airborne Division were sent there to reopen the base. They dug trenches, built bunkers, and laid sandbags under the constant echo of distant artillery. Most were young, tired, counting down the days until their rotation home. They didn't know that the North Vietnamese army had been watching every move. The valley below was crawling with enemy troops. Thousands of them. They were preparing for a siege. Every trail, every ridge, every piece of jungle concealment hid something with teeth. Still, the Americans worked. Helicopters ferried in supplies, ammo, and men, while enemy spotters recorded each landing. The officers on Ripcord had been told it was a limited mission, short, contained, safe. But the longer they stayed, the more the jungle started whispering warnings. Radio chatter picked up strange patterns. Night patrols found footprints, too many to count. And on the 10th night, a flare went up over the valley, painting the sky in red and white. Then everything went dark again. The next morning, one soldier said it out loud, "We're being watched." He was right. Ripcord wasn't an outpost anymore. It was a target. By the end of that week, the valley would explode with fire and steel. The enemy was closing in. The air smelled of rain and cordite. Every man on that hill knew what was coming. They just didn't know how many would survive it. The siege of Firebase Ripcord was about to begin. The first shell landed just after sunrise, a single explosion that shook the hill and shattered the morning calm. Then came another, and another. Within seconds, Firebase Ripcord was drowning in fire. Mortars fell in steady rhythm, walking up the slopes like footsteps of thunder. Men scrambled for cover, diving into half-finished bunkers as the air filled with dust and splinters. The sky, once pale and still, turned black with smoke. The siege had begun. Across the valley, hidden in the tree line, hundreds of North Vietnamese guns fired in unison. Their aim was precise. They had been planning this moment for weeks. Every gun emplacement, every trajectory was mapped to the inch. Radio operators screamed for counter-battery fire. Medics dragged the wounded into foxholes, their hands shaking from concussion. Machine gunners fired blind into the jungle, trying to hit an enemy they couldn't see. A helicopter attempted to bring in supplies, food, water, ammunition, but the second it broke the cloud line, traces ripped through its tail. The aircraft burst into flame and spiraled down, exploding on the northern slope. Everyone on board was lost. From that moment, Ripcord was cut off. The men were surrounded, outnumbered, and outgunned. Some counted the muzzle flashes across the valley. There weren't dozens. There were hundreds. Estimates said 2,000 enemy troops were tightening the noose. On the hill, fewer than 200 Americans remained. The fighting was constant. Artillery roared day and night. The jungle around Ripcord burned until the trees themselves looked like ghosts. The defenders ran low on food, then on water, then on hope. Every time they called for resupply, helicopters were hit. Every time they tried to reinforce, the landing zone filled with shrapnel. But no one talked about retreat. The 101st Airborne had a reputation to protect and a brotherhood to uphold. So they dug deeper, fought harder, and refused to break. At night, flares floated down through the smoke, casting the battlefield in a sickly white glow. Men could see shadows moving at the edge of the perimeter. Enemy soldiers crawling, probing, waiting for the next attack. The Americans braced themselves, fingers on triggers, hearts pounding. The jungle wasn't silent anymore, it was screaming, and Firebase Ripcord was about to be swallowed whole. By the end of the first week, Firebase Ripcord had turned into a cratered moonscape. The hill was chewed to pieces, no trees, no shade, just smoking earth and broken sandbags. The men of the 101st Airborne fought, slept and bled in the same holes they had dug with their bare hands. Each day began with incoming fire, mortars before dawn, rockets by noon, snipers after dark. Every hour carried a new kind of danger. There was no rest, no escape, only the steady rhythm of explosions and the smell of burned powder clinging to the air. Helicopters tried to reach them, but most never made it. Pilots called Ripcord the meat grinder. Dozens of aircraft went down, their wreckage scattered along the ridges. The few that landed did so under a storm of bullets, skidding across the pad while soldiers threw ammo and bodies aboard before liftoff. Down in the bunkers, medics worked in near darkness. They patched torn limbs, stopped bleeding with their own hands, and whispered prayers that no one heard. The radio net was a wall of noise. Airstrikes, coordinates, screams, silence. Then it would start again. By the 10th day, the defenders were running low on everything. Water, food, medical supplies, even ammunition. The jungle rain filled their helmets and canteens, but it brought no relief. Leeches clung to their skin. The mud swallowed their boots. Still, no one talked about surrender. At night, the NVA came in waves, dozens at a time, charging through fire, screaming as they hit the wire. The Americans answered with grenades, claymores, and raw fury. The fighting was close, so close that men could smell the sweat and blood of the enemy they were killing. Each morning, the sun revealed the cost. Bodies in the wire, craters filled with ash. The wounded carried to the makeshift aid station, many never to leave. Command promised reinforcements. They never arrived. The men realised what no one dared to say out loud. They were on their own. For 23 days Ripcord held, outnumbered 10-1, bombarded without mercy, kept alive only by stubbornness and brotherhood. Every man on that hill knew he was already in hell, and somehow they kept fighting anyway. By the third week, Ripcord was little more than a scar on the landscape, a torn hilltop swallowed by smoke and fire. The men still standing were gaunt, sleepless, running on instinct and adrenaline. Their faces were grey from dust and gunpowder. Every breath hurt. Every sound meant death might be seconds away. The constant roar of mortars had deafened them, the stench of blood and cordite clung to their clothes, and the wind carried the faint echoes of voices calling for help that would never come. Every inch of ground had been fought for, bled for, and burned a dozen times over. The jungle around the hill was now a wasteland of shattered trees and smoking craters, a reminder that Ripcord was no longer a place, it was a wound. When the order finally came down, evacuate Ripcord, no one believed it. They had fought too long, lost too many, and buried too much to simply walk away. But headquarters had made the call. The hill could no longer be held. The realisation hit like a gut punch. For some, it felt like betrayal. For others, mercy. Either way, Ripcord's defenders knew what it meant. They had to leave the dead behind. Evacuation began under fire. The first helicopters came in low, blades slicing through the smoke, landing for only seconds at a time. Pilots hovered with one skid touching the ground while soldiers threw the wounded aboard. Tracer rounds whipped through the air. Some aircraft never made it out. They hit the slopes in burning spirals, men jumping free as explosions rolled across the valley. The air was filled with screams, orders, and the thunder of rotors chopping through chaos. On the ground, small groups covered the retreat, firing until their barrels glowed. One by one, they pulled back toward the landing zone, dragging their wounded brothers behind them. Nobody wanted to be the last man off the hill, but someone always was. The last few fighters emptied their magazines, threw grenades into the wire, and sprinted for the helicopters through a storm of bullets. When the final flight lifted, only a few were left to cover it. They fired until the last second, then ran for the skids as bullets ripped through the grass. The pilot yanked the helicopter up, climbing into the storm of smoke and tracer fire. Ripcord was officially abandoned. The men inside the chopper watched the hill vanish beneath them, the place they had defended for weeks shrinking into a column of flame. Minutes later, American artillery opened up from miles away. The guns turned the hill into rubble, erasing every bunker, every foxhole, every trace of the base the men had fought to defend. The ground shook for hours, as if the earth itself was trying to bury the memory. The smoke rose so high that pilots miles away could see it blotting out the sun. Even the jungle went silent. When the shelling stopped, Ripcord was gone. Nothing but blackened earth and silence remained. 75 Americans were dead, hundreds wounded. The North Vietnamese left more than 1,000 bodies in the jungle. Yet for decades the battle was barely mentioned. buried under the shadow of a war everyone wanted to forget. The men who survived remembered it differently, not as a lost hill, but as a brotherhood that refused to break. For 23 days, they faced the impossible and did not yield. Firebase Ripcord may have vanished from the map, but its courage never did. It lives in the hearts of those who were there, etched in memory, burned into history. Proof that even in the darkest corners of war, valour still finds a way to shine. If you made it this far, thank you for walking this road with us. If you love stories like this, true stories about courage, endurance, and forgotten history, make sure to subscribe, hit like, and tap the hype button so more people can discover them too.